Today we're going to be talking about epidemiology and management of oak wilt, and ideally we're going to be talking about different things, ranging from identification to disease cycle to management as well. And also I'm going to touch on a few projects that our team has been working in the last couple of years as well. So thanks everyone for joining, and let's start. So let's start by the basics, right? What is oak wilt? So oak wilt is one of the most destructive tree diseases in the United States, and it's been killing oak trees in some areas at what we call epidemic proportions, right? And this is a disease that is caused by a fungus. It's called Brezziella fagacearum, and it is what we call a primary vascular pathogen. And what that means is that it doesn't really matter if the host, in this case a tree, is going to be stressed or not, right? We usually hear about things like secondary pests, that these are both fungi and insects that go after stressed trees. In this case, when we say a primary pathogen, that means that it doesn't really matter if the tree is stressed. In this case, it's going to attack it either way. So the way this disease works is that the fungus is going to invade the water conducting vessels of the tree. That's basically the xylem. And the tree is going to respond by plugging the tissues, right? And that's going to result in a lack of water to the leaves, and therefore the tree is going to die. If you ever have heard about other diseases, for example, laurel wilt, this is a very similar situation of what we see with that kind of pathogen. So oak wilt was first described in the early 1940s up north in Wisconsin, and after that it has been reported in multiple states in central and northern in the northeast of the United States. And more recently, the thing keeps spreading. More recently, in 2023, it also been recorded for the first time in southeastern Canada. You can see that for those little red dots that we have there. And when we look a little bit closer to Texas, it was first detected in Dallas in 1961. And we do have some records from like the early 1930s of some reports kind of like mentioning this disease in places like Austin, but it was never confirmed as oak wilt. So the first official report actually came out in the 1960s. And so far as of 2023, we have 76 counties that have been confirmed with oak wilt. And you can see there in the map that the darker the color of the county, basically that means that we have recorded more mortality centers. So as you can see, this is something that definitely affects a large portions of the hill country, a large portion of central Texas as well. So this fungus, after it was described, and it was first described as the species Callara quercina, it actually changed names a few times, right? And if you look back on the literature, the bulk of the information that we know and the information that we know for this fungus is actually under the name of Ceratocystis fagacearum. But a few years ago, this was around 2017, a group of researchers from South Africa actually put together a phylogenetic tree based on multiple genes, and that actually supported the idea that this was a different genus. And basically, they created this genus called Brezziella. This comes after the person who described the fungus for the first time, whose name was Bretz. So Brezziella, it's a new genus that accommodated the oak wilt fungus, and this was done only like 5 years ago. So the most recent information is going to be under this name. So Brezziella is an ascomycet. This is a large group of fungi that produce spores in these structures or these sacs that are called ascus, and that's where the ascomycet name comes from. And as we already say, it's a vascular parasite. And it has this particular thing that it creates these fungal mats under the bark of certain trees. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. But basically create these structures full of spores that are called fungal mats. And it's also a very heat-sensitive fungus. It's going to thrive in temperatures around 75 Fahrenheit. But if you go to higher temperatures, like above 85, it actually is going to stop growing, and in some cases even it's going to start dying. So one important thing to consider here is that all oaks are susceptible to oak wilt, right? And we expect to see different susceptibility in case of different groups of oaks. But basically what happens is that red oaks are going to be extremely susceptible to the pathogen. And they actually play a unique role in the disease spread. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that when we discuss the disease cycle. But red oaks are extremely susceptible. White oaks, on the other hand, are actually less susceptible to the disease. However, they are not immune to infection. They can get infected and they can show mortality as well. Live oaks, on the other hand, they are in some sort of intermediate state in their susceptibility, and they actually are seriously affected because they have a lot of interconnected roots across the landscape, and we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. But these are a group of trees that in places like Texas is highly relevant in terms of oak wilt. So there has been some discussion on the actual origins of oak wilt. For example, at some point we thought that it might be endemic. It will show at low incidence until things like increased disturbances or changes in land use maybe, or even forest management actually will create the conditions for these disease epidemics. However, evidence that we now know, the current evidence, supports the scenario that this was an introduced species to the United States, and it was probably originated in some region where it's actually less aggressive to oaks, for example, Central America. However, we don't know exactly where it might be coming from. And the reason we think this is because there is some evidence that when you look at, for example, the different populations across the United States, there's actually very limited genetic variation, right? And also, in addition to that, there's a high susceptibility of red oaks. Red oaks actually die very fast. And those things basically suggest that the fungus might not even have evolved here. So when we think about the spread, there are two different types of spreads of the fungus. So the first one is what we call below ground spread. And in this case, the fungus and the spores of the fungus are going to move through the infected, through the root system from one infected oak to another, right? This is a very common mechanism that happens in live oaks, for example. Live oaks have a very large root system that graft with other trees around them. So they create this massive network in the landscape. And the other type of spread that we see for oak wilt is what we call above ground spread. And that is going to be based on very little tiny insects that are called sap beetles or knitted dewlet beetles. That's the name of the family. And you can see some of them there on the right on the image. But these are basically very tiny insects that are going to move the spores from an infected tree, an infected red oaks, and we're going to be discussing more about that later, to a healthy tree. So that's how basically the spores are moved from tree to tree. And we know that these, we're saying that live oaks are very relevant for the below ground spread. Basically, the interconnected root system is what helps this disease to move around, helps the pathogen, to move around. And we know that it actually moves on average around 75 feet a year, right? And this is kind of like a number that we call it an average because when we have certain conditions like drought, we know it's going to move a little bit slower. If we have a very rainy year, it's going to actually move faster. But on average, it's going to move around 75 feet a year through the interconnected root system. And I want to give a big shout out to Dave Apple, Dr. Dave Apple, who has done a lot of research, a lot of work for this disease. And a lot of the data that I'm going to be showing have been originated from research that he has been doing in the last decade. So I just wanted to mention that before moving forward. So this is there's a lot of information in this slide, but I wanted to share kind of like how the oak wilt disease cycle looks like. And if we think about places like the northeastern United States where we don't have really like live oaks, basically we're going to only have what we call the red oak phase, right? But here in Texas, things are a little bit more complicated. But it all starts with a fresh wound on a healthy oak. And I'm going to try to walk you guys through this. I think you should be able to see a laser point here. But it all is going to start with a fresh wound on a healthy oak. So if that fresh wound on a healthy oak happens on a live oak, and white oaks is kind of like the same thing, what is going to happen is that we're going to have an infected tree, and we're going to have local spread via those interconnected roots. This is what we were mentioning earlier as this below ground spread. As a consequence of that, we're going to have just a bunch of dead live oaks, but those are not going to form any of these fungal mats, any of these structures that are going to be full of spores, right? Trees are just going to die. However, when the fresh wound happens on a healthy oak that is a red oak, what we're going to see is in some conditions, depending on where that infection happens, depending on what time of the year that infection happens, we can have a dying red oak, typically in the fall or the winter, and that is going to produce, in some cases, this fungal mat formation. So basically, this is kind of like a patch under the bark of red oaks that is going to be full of spores, and it's going to produce a very sweet odor, kind of like a fruity smell. And these nitidulid beetles, these sap beetles, are going to be very attracted to this fungal mat. So they're going to, feed on that mat. They're going to hang out in that mat, and then they're going to fly to a fresh wound of a healthy oak, moving all the spores from the diseased red oaks to a healthy oak. And that's kind of like what happens with the cycle. That's how the disease spreads from tree to tree. It could be either through the interconnected roots, that's below ground spread, or the above ground spread through the beetles. So let's talk a little bit about these different fungal mats, right? So fungal mats are only produced in these red oaks. And you can see an image here. These are produced under the bark. So imagine that we are removing the bark. Typically, if you look at the bark, you will see some sort of a crack in the bark, a little line, and you can actually smell the sweet or fruity smell under that crack, that pressure pad that the fungus is producing. And the production of these fungal mats is usually accelerated by cool and moist weather, right? And particularly in the spring, these are very common to find with trees that have died the previous winter or fall. So these fungal mats are covered in spores, and I really like this image. This is an image from the 1960s, but it was kind of like one of the first attempts to describe this whole process of what was going on with the beetles and the fungal mats, and trying to explain how these spores were actually produced. So fungal mats are actually covered in spores, right? And these spores, which are actually asexual spores, can be very easily picked up by the beetles. And it turns out that there are two different types of mats. We call them the type A or type B. Imagine, it's not exactly the same, but imagine like male and female. And the insects actually start moving these spores from a type A to a type B, right? And when that happens, that's when the sexual spore or the ascospores are produced. And those are the very resistant type of spores that are ideal to produce. And a lot of you are going to be like, what on earth are you talking about? All these like different types of spores, different things that are going on in the fungal mats. Well, the bottom line here, the take-home message is that basically when this process happens, that increases the variability and adaptability of the fungus, right? It can produce this durable hydrophobic ascospores that the fungus wants to produce. And those are going to be carried very easily by the insects. So let's talk a little bit about some of the signs and symptoms that we expect to see with oak wilt, right? Different types of oaks are going to produce different symptoms. So, for example, in red oaks, we expect to see things like flagging or marginal necrosis on the leaves. Typically, it's going to keep those leaves that are kind of like red, as you can see there, or browning, as you can see there in the image. And what we have with red oaks is that we expect to see 100% mortality. So all red oaks are going to die between 4 to 6 weeks after they start showing symptoms, and there's no exception. What happens sometimes is that also the disease can spread to adjacent trees. That's happened through the interconnected root system as well. And again, these are the only group of trees that can form those fungal mats. And you can see there again, this is, we removed a patch of the bark, and under the bark, you can see that, that fungal mat full of the spores and full of beetles as well. White oaks, on the other hand, are less susceptible to the disease. However, again, they're not immune. So in some cases, some trees like post oaks are actually very resistant. We barely have any issues, and we probably have seen very little post oaks with, dying because of oak wilt. However, some of these other white oaks, they show some symptoms, and the common things that we've seen had to do with thinning or flagging of the leaves. We see some tip burn, maybe some marginal necrosis on those leaves. And these are, you can see that in some of these pictures of chinkapin and Monterey oaks in Central Texas. So this is something typical that we expect to find for white oaks that have been infected with oak wilt. Live oaks, on the other hand, they produce kind of like a rapid defoliation, and they tend to die between 3 and 6 months. And this is basically the group of trees, the species that the spread into adjacent trees through the root system is very relevant for the spread of the disease, right? In this case, this very large interconnected root system plays a very significant role. However, they do not produce any fungal mats, right? Fungal mats are only produced in red oaks. And, if you basically let these trees get oak wilt and you don't do any management, and we're going to be talking about management in a little bit, but if you don't do anything about it, typically you expect to find a 5 to 15% survival rate with no treatment, right? So after, an oak wilt center is developed in live oaks, you expect to see that some of them are actually going to survive. And you can see here some of the typical symptoms that we expect to see with live oaks. So from left to right, the first one is called vein banding. The central one, the second one, the one in the middle, is called veinal necrosis. That is the most typical symptom that we expect to see for oak wilt in live oaks, a very characteristical symptom. And the third one is what we call marginal necrosis or tip burn. And all of these three can happen in live oaks in Texas. And when you look at the anatomy of the trees, it actually gives you a lot of answers on why do you think this different susceptibility might be happening, right? So, for example, if you look at the bezels on the oak trees, you can see all these like little black dots on the image. If you look at the bezels on the oak trees, you can see that those are ideal routes for the spread of the fungus within the tree, right? So if you look at the red oak, for example, most of the early wood bezels seem to be open, including several of these outermost growth rings, right? So all of these are kind of like very open, and the fungus can move freely around there. But if you look at the white oaks here, early wood bezels are actually occluded, except for those in the most recent growth, right? So basically the fungus has very little places to move around. In the live oaks, it's what we call kind of like a semi-porous. It's kind of like aggregated bezels here and there, but it's kind of like an intermediate situation, right? And that's kind of like what we see with the different symptoms and the mortality that we expect as well, right? We have all of these, when you look closely, or if you look more in detail, we have all these different structures. They're called tyloses or bubble-like structures that are kind of like limit the movement of the fungus in some of these groups, for example, in white oaks, right? So that's why we expect different things in different groups of oaks. And an important note in terms of diagnosis, when we talk about diagnosis, we typically look at different things to confirm oak wilt. And the reason for that is because there are many things that are going to cause different, they're going to cause similar symptoms. For example, severe drought, something that we experienced this year in the last couple of months, or for example, overwatering, are going to produce similar symptoms to what we are seeing in oak wilt for live oak, for example. That banal necrosis is something that we can see sometimes with severe drought. So the way we talk about this is basically with a 5-step process, and that will be, first we look at the pattern of mortality, what species of trees are dying, how is the disease actually moving. In case of live oaks versus red oaks, it's going to be a different pattern. We also look at the individual trees. How is the mortality, or what are the symptoms in the crown, and what is going on with that? And then we start looking at the foliar symptoms, right? We start looking for that banal necrosis. We'll start looking for that marginal necrosis. And of course, in the case of a red oak, we will look for the presence of fungal mats as well. And ultimately, in some cases, we also take samples for confirmation, for lab confirmation, because in some cases or some years where the symptoms can be confused with something else, we try to be careful, and we encourage people to take and submit samples for diagnosis. So when we talk about diagnosis, typically, we talk about fungal culturing. That's, through standard pathogen isolation methods. Here in Texas, the Texas Plant Disease Diagnosis Lab does a great job, and we work very closely with them for diagnosis of the pathogen. And a quick note also, there's been other tools that can be used for diagnosis. Lately, molecular tools based on PCR have been widely used for many different pathogens and insects as well. But a quick note on molecular diagnostics, nested PCR or qPCR that you might have heard in terms of PCR identification can be very useful tools to detect oak wilt. However, it's very important to understand that depending on how we conduct that PCR, and that could be, different PCR conditions, different primers, and all the little details that have to do with how we do that PCR, we can get different results, right? So different diagnostic labs across the US will do different things, but most of them are going to do like a combination of culturing with molecular methods. So just be aware of these details if in case you need to get a confirmation for oak wilt. And for that reason, we've been working with multiple colleagues, both institution, private and public, to kind of like work in this thing of diagnosis and surveillance and kind of improve the different methods that we've seen. So we are collaborating with the University of Georgia. They're leading a project using this technique that is called LAMP. Don't worry about the names here, but basically this is kind of like a very specific and rapid PCR that can be conducted in the field, and they basically have tried this before for other pathogens, things like laurel wilt or peach canker in pines, and they have been showing promising results. So we're working with them to develop this technology for oak wilt as well. Okay, so let's talk about oak wilt management, right? So we kind of understand what the disease cycle is. We kind of understand how to identify that, how to look for the symptoms, the signs. So what can we do about it? Oak wilt is one of the things where early detection and action are essential for a successful management of oak wilt, right? And, measures are not going to completely eradicate the disease from the landscape, but they're definitely going to reduce tree losses in your property for sure. So when we talk about management, we have 4 primary approaches. We have to focus on prevention. We have to talk about diversity planning. We're going to have to talk about trenching and also about fungicide injection. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these. So when we talk about prevention, what we want to do is, of course, prevent a new oak wilt infection from happening, right? And that will have to do with pruning management. Will have to do with what do we do with the red oaks that actually get infected before they actually form the fungal mats. And it has to do with also firewood management. And you're going to see that when we talk about prevention, we're going to be talking mostly about what's going on with the beetles, right? Because these insects, and this is just like examples of a few species that are very common, moving, spores in our states, but also other states as well. And these things are very tiny, and they have a lot of questions that we actually haven't answered yet about the biology and the ecology of this group. So keep this in mind while we go through all of these different prevention methods, right? So the first thing to consider is pruning management. So, the first recommendation is always to avoid wounding oaks in the spring. And I put a little asterisk there because that's going to kind of like look different depending on what states we are in. In our case in Texas, basically that means from February to June, we avoid pruning the oaks in that season. But, if we're thinking about Minnesota or Wisconsin, that's going to probably look from April to July, getting into August as well. So just an asterisk of, when we're reading information about oak wilt, keep that in mind. That is kind of like going to look, those recommendations can look very different depending on where we are. And the second thing to consider is that regardless of the season, we want to immediately paint all pruning cuts and other wounds to oaks. And any kind of paint can be used. The goal here is to put a physical barrier so the beetles cannot introduce the spores. Okay? And, we get a lot of questions sometimes of like how specific this is or how fast we need to paint this, or if, beetles are actually moving that fast in the spring. Well, the reality is that we have a lot of information that basically has shown that in that particular time of the year, that's basically in the spring, that's when we have most of the mats, the fungal mats, but we also have most of the contaminated insects that are moving the spores from tree to tree. So you can see here some graphs. That the details doesn't really matter, but basically what they are showing is that for different places, the first one for Texas and the other ones are for the northeast of the United States. In that time of the year, basically spring, that's when we have most of the beetles flying and moving the spores, right? In our case, again, it's going to be from February to June. But we also know that it's very important to paint as soon as possible. And that's because in the first 3 days, and you can see that this is data from Minnesota, but also from Texas, and you can see that within the first 3 days of the wounding happening, that's when you get most of the beetles, right? So after 72 hours, you're not going to be that wound is not going to be visited by many of these sub beetles. But in those 3 days, that's when you want to avoid the risk. That's why it's important that if we do a cut, if we make a cut, we want to paint it as soon as possible. So once we get a red oak that is basically infected, we also need to control that disease red oak, right? And the idea here is that we want to reduce the opportunity for fungal mats to form. And the way we do this is basically destroying all the infected red oaks. We can do that by burning, chipping, or burying, kind of like depending where you're located in a city or rural areas. Different methods are going to be easier. But regardless of where you are, it's important that we never store infected red oaks for firewood. And the reason for that is because once you cut a red oak that has been infected, it can actually produce the fungal mats. So even if you cut it and you store it there in your backyard, after a few weeks, it can actually still produce the fungal mats after it's being cut. So that's something very important to consider. So when we talk about prevention, there are different things to consider, right? So on one hand, we have different species of sub beetles, these nitty-duled beetles that are going to hang out and feed on these fungal mats. On the other hand, we're going to have, some of these beetles that are also going to be attracted to the fresh wounds after you make a cut, for example, pruning. And the other thing to consider is that these fungal mats are going to be available different times of the year because the conditions need to be right, but they're going to be, more abundant or more common in a particular time of the year, right? And when all of these three things basically coincide, that is, or basically where they intercept, that's what you want to be paying attention to. Those are the vectors that we need to know and we need to be aware, because that's the time frame, that's the period of time where we are under most of the risk, right? And for that reason, we have been working for a year and a half so far with colleagues at the University of Tennessee, looking exactly at that, right? We are trapping beetles every couple weeks, and we are identifying not only what species of beetles are flying, but also what of these species are actually moving the spores from tree to tree, which are very different questions. So moving forward to tree planting, of course, we want to reduce the effects of oak wilt by creating diversity in the landscape. This is something that is very relevant. Basically, what we want to avoid is planting monocultures, right? We want to have the right tree for the right place. And of course, selecting trees that are native or adapted to the region, and trees that, maybe even resistant or immune to oak wilt, basically selecting other tree species for that landscape that we are discussing. And a valid question is, okay, so like what trees should we plant, because we have no idea. So you guys can actually look at this website. This is texasoakwilt.org, and this website works kind of like a hub for all the information that we have on oak wilt for the state. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this website later, but just to let you know that under the tab of resources, we have recommended trees depending on what counties you're in, what region you're in, what type of tree do you want. So we have different recommendations for that. So definitely be sure to check that out. So let's move to trenching. So trenching basically means that you're stopping the spreading of oak wilt through the interconnected roots by destroying those connections, right? What you're doing is creating a physical barrier, basically cutting those roots, and therefore you're avoiding that below ground spread to happen. You are basically blocking that fungus to keep moving through the root system. That's something that we typically, do more commonly in rural environments. However, they also happen, and we've done some on urban on cities as well. So the way this works is that you first start by determining the disease perimeter using visual symptoms and all the stuff that we already talked about, the pattern of mortality, the leaf symptoms, etc. And then you basically find all of these disease trees, and you place a trench 100 feet ahead of the disease, right? Remember, the disease moves around 75 feet a year on average, so you want to be a little bit ahead of that. So we basically count 100 feet from the last disease tree, and that's where we place the trench. And typically that is going to be at a minimum depth of 4 feet. In some cases, if we have if we have deeper soils, we have to go deeper depending on location and soil depth, substrate, etc. We definitely going to have to adjust even the equipment that is being used. Now, when we think about injection, basically what we're doing is preventing or stopping oak wilt by introducing a fungicide into the xylem, right? You're injecting a fungicide into the xylem, and that is going to keep those vessels, it's going to keep those tissues open and functional, right? And the idea with the injection is that you want to protect high-value oaks in advance of an expanding oak wilt center. So basically, the best candidates for the treatment are going to be healthy, non-symptomatic trees that are 75 feet to 100 feet from the symptomatic trees. However, we can still treat trees that are starting to show symptoms. It's going to have kind of like depend what is the stage and what is the situation and what oak species it is, but we can also treat trees that have been infected already. But the best candidate is going to be the healthy, non-symptomatic trees that are 75 to 100 feet from that symptomatic tree. And the way this works is that the thing that is recommended, that we recommend, is what is called micro injection with propiconazole. Propiconazole is a fungicide that affects some key pathways in fungal cell wall formation, right? So basically, that way, once you inject the fungicide, it's going to stop fungal growth, right? And macro injection basically means that you use a high volume and low pressure. You can see that you basically dig a little bit of the root flare, and you dig and you drill different holes on the base of the tree, and then you inject this fungicide that is going to be taken up by the tree and moving and spreading it across the tree. And you want to have at least 30% of the canopy loss. The reason for that is that the way the fungicide is going to move inside the tree is through transpiration, right? So when trees transpire through the leaves, they're going to pull water from the roots, and that's how water actually gets moved through the whole tree. So basically, if you don't have any leaves, it's going to be hard to pull that chemical up into the canopy as well and spread it homogeneously. And again, all species can be injected, but one important thing to consider with tree injections, and this is I will say the most critical point when we're talking about injections for oak wilt, is that injection is not going to stop the root transmission of the fungus. So you're basically protected individual trees, right? So you can choose these couple trees that you want to protect because you don't want them to die, and that's going to work great, but you're not stopping the transmission of the fungus through the root system. That root system is going to be still interconnected, and it's going to keep spreading below ground. So let's talk a little bit of what's been going on in Texas, right? We know that thousands of acres throughout Central and West Texas have been affected by oak wilt, and we know that also affects the property values, right? Like both in urban and suburban areas. So the question is, why these oak wilt actually became a problem in Texas? And there are actually multiple factors that explain this. We have, tree community and structure. We have a dominance of live oaks and red oaks across the landscape, and that's very important. And we also have, past influence of European settlement and land use practices. We have, fire suppression. We have overgrazing. We have selectively removed all non-oak species. So all of those things definitely play a role in what we're seeing in Texas as well. And of course, we also have an increased population and development. So we have, ranchettes and houses and different things being built all the time. A lot of people coming to Texas, and in some cases, people are unfamiliar with what the symptoms or what the signs of oak wilt are, and they never seen or heard of the disease. So that's also a different problem as well. And for that reason, we've been running as part of the Texas Land and Forest Service what we call the Oak Wilt Suppression Project. And this is something that it's based on federal funding, and it's basically a project that has been going for around 35 years. And the goal of the project is to minimize the spread of oak wilt in Central Texas. And you can follow that QR code. It's going to take you to some of the details of the project and more information about the project. But basically, just to give a very short overview on how this actually works, is that we have different regional areas, and we have different foresters or woodland ecologists that actually are attending to all these different counties where oak wilt is a big problem, and they provide technical on-site service to landowners, right? And in some cases, we even provide support with cost shares to these landowners as well. So basically, the process is that we identify and map all the mortality centers across the landscape, across Texas. And in some cases, for example, for containment trenching or for doing these trenches, and also for removal of the diseased red oaks, we provide different cost shares, which basically is that you landowners will do the treatment, and we cover part of those costs. And of course, public education and awareness are a big part of this project and our current and ongoing efforts as well. And again, that is the website where you can find all of the information about this. It's very important because basically, if you go to the Get Help tab and under Find My Forester, you actually are going to be contacted as a landowner with the forester for your county where you're located. And if you ever have an issue with oak wilt, you need confirmation or information, or what are the next steps to take on this disease, that's when you're going to find all the information and all the contacts for what to do. And just as a final, kind of like a final note to wrap up, there's a lot of oak wilt resources that are available that you guys can use, and not only for information. Texas, the website that we maintain is kind of like this hub for the Texas Oak Wilt Suppression Project, which of course is not only us but multiple partners, both private and public. Has a lot of information about oak wilt for the state, not only the cost shares, but also about the disease and all the stuff that I kind of like touched on today as well. So you can go there and find your certified arborist. That's what we typically recommend. And they also going to have this oak wilt qualified arborist certification, which is going to be, an additional step for professional arborists. And with that, I can take any questions. Thank you all for listening. Here's my contact information, but also the Central Texas team QR code as well. That's where you're going to find all the information for oak wilt, but also